You are listening to Book Clips, a mini podcast in which authors or narrators do readings from novels. Check out the show notes for the synopsis and buy links for this book.
Hi, this is A.L. Brooks, and today I'm going to be reading from my latest novel, Write Your Own Script. Just to give you a little background for the section I'm going to read, Tamsyn Harris is a 50-something actress who has been forced to lie low after a little incident on the set of her latest film. Maggie is an author suffering from burnout who is on retreat with her dog, Gizmo. Unbeknown to both women, they are neighbours, each staying on a country estate in Norfolk, East England, in secluded cottages about 200 yards apart. Strolling through the trees had become Maggie's new favourite thing this past week. Usually they were confined to the local park near her house in Putney. Having such an expanse to play in had sent her beloved border terrier into paroxysms of delight, and his enthusiasm was infectious. So what if she hadn't written a single word since she'd arrived here? They reached the gravel driveway of her cottage and shimmied past the car to get to the front door. She glanced back at the other cottage, the single light coming from what she knew was the kitchen, and hoped that whoever was staying there hadn't been too disturbed by Gizmo's antics. Gizmo squeezed through the door before she'd even got it fully open, and ran straight to his water bowl, where he lapped noisily for a couple of minutes, while she removed her coat and shoes. It was nicely nippy out, and her face was tingling now that she was back in the warmth of the cottage. She walked over to the fire and added some more wood, noting that her pile was diminishing but would at least last her through tomorrow morning. The bottle of red wine she'd opened the night before was standing on the kitchen counter, and moments later she was sipping a large glass by the fire. She'd taken to sitting in the single armchair. The sofa was comfy enough, but there was something even more comforting about being embraced completely by the chair, Gizmo usually either laying on the floor by the fire or wedged between her folded legs and one arm of the chair. She stared at the flames as they danced in the grate. Her eyes felt tired. Hell, the whole of her felt tired. The burnout had hit her hard and fast, and although she knew her recovery would happen at its own good pace, she couldn't help but will it to go faster. She had deadlines to meet, fans to keep happy. She snorted, and Gizmo, who had passed out in front of the fire after guzzling down his water, twitched in his slumber. She hadn't written a word in 3 months. Both her publishers were clamouring for new titles, but she didn't have it in her. The ideas weren't there, and sitting in front of a blank screen wasn't conjuring up any inspiration. So here she was, on retreat, as she was calling it. She'd agreed with her mainstream agent that she would take a month off, see if she could free the block. She had no idea what would happen if it didn't work. The warmth of the wine and the fire were making her drowsy, and her head dipped. This was the other thing she couldn't quite get used to. She was tired, constantly tired. Of course you're tired. You're burnt out. You have nothing left in the tank. Burnt out. She thought that only happened to city workers, the people making all the big deals in the financial market. It had never occurred to her it could happen to a writer of romances, for crying out loud. She chuckled. Gizmo raised his head, his liquid brown eyes blinking at her. "Relax," she said, and took another sip of wine. "It's just me, going slightly bonkers." "No, not bonkers, not really. Just a bit lost." "Stand still, you little bugger." Maggie grabbed Gizmo by his collar and hauled him back towards her. "I thought you loved walks. Why are you fighting me on this?" She finally managed to clip the lead into place and stood upright again. As soon as she did, Gizmo strained the leather leash in his eagerness to reach the front door. "Good God, you're fickle." Stumbling after the little dynamo, she grabbed the keys from the small table in the entranceway and locked the door behind them once they were on the front step. The cold pricked at her ears, and she smiled. Another beautiful morning in this small piece of paradise. And to her, it was paradise. Nothing but nature all around. After yet another restless night, she knew the fresh air would do her good. It was crazy, she thought, as she let Gizmo lead them towards the path that squirmed through an opening in the trees about a minute from the back of their cottage. That for someone so worn out, she couldn't get a decent night's sleep. She hadn't done since the first night here. The speed with which she'd booked the trip, packed, and closed up her house had worn her down to the point where not sleeping was impossible once she'd arrived at the cottage. But since then, of course, all of her doubts about her writing had plagued her brain, and so far, none of the remedies she tried for easing her mind before sleep had worked. They were in the trees now, and the change in the sounds around them, and in the very air itself, soothed her. Maybe she should try sleeping out here one night. She snorted. Yes, so not going to happen. Imagine all the wildlife skittering around. She'd give herself a heart attack before daybreak, wondering if she was going to be eaten by wild animals. Even though she knew it was ridiculous, there were no carnivorous predators in Norfolk. The thought of exposing herself to the rawness of nature that way did not appeal. A yelp from Gizmo brought her sharply out of her reverie, and she looked around to see what had him so worked up. Then she stopped and stared, because standing on the path ahead of them, looking concerned at the noise and the rather agitated little hops Gizmo was making, was Tamsyn Harris. Maggie shook her head. No, there was no way that could possibly be Tamsyn Harris, standing in a Norfolk woodland, all alone, only 20 paces or so in front of her. Tamsyn Harris was a world-famous actress who splits her time between London and Los Angeles, eating out at all the best restaurants and being seen in all the most fashionable places when she wasn't working on a film or TV series. This woman, whoever she was, just had a remarkable likeness to her, that's all. Mind you, it was extraordinary how much her double she was. "Good morning," Maggie called, yanking Gizmo back on his lead and pointing a finger at him that said, "Behave," when he turned reproachful eyes on her. "Is your dog safe?" the woman replied. Maggie was affronted. Safe? Of course Gizmo was safe. What a ridiculous thing to... Only I'm not exactly a fan of dogs. She sounded like Tamsyn Harris too, with that hint of huskiness in the posh but not too posh tone that Tamsyn Harris used. Maggie stared at her again, taking in all her features. The chestnut brown hair was mostly hidden by a stylish woolen cap, but it was the right shade. She wasn't close enough for Maggie to see her eyes, but the height seemed about right, even in the flat walking boots she wore. And the body shape was too, although many women were as slim as Tamsyn, so that wasn't much of a clue. When Maggie let her gaze drift back to the woman's face, she realised she was still waiting for Maggie's response. "Oh, sorry. Gizmo's fine, don't worry. All bark and no trousers, this one." Gizmo whimpered, as if offended. Finally the woman smiled. It was weak, but even so it transformed her face, and suddenly, right then, Maggie knew. That smile was unmistakable. Holy crap. The actress walked slowly towards her, then gestured to the path. "I'm just going to pass by, okay?" Of course." Maggie's heart was thundering beneath her ribs. Tamsyn bloody Harris! Maggie's celebrity crush since she was 18 years old, only yards away from her and about to walk within inches of her. How was that even possible? Tamsyn approached, gave Maggie a half smile, then sidestepped around Gizmo with caution. He stared up at her, his mouth open, tongue lolling, and for a brief moment Maggie wondered if she was standing in the middle of the pathway in much the same manner. A quick check confirmed that, to her relief, her tongue was still contained within her closed mouth. She knew, however, that her eyes were as wide as saucers. She should say something. Ask her, "Are you really Tamsyn Harris?" But her brain wouldn't engage properly, and when it did, her overwhelming sense was, much to her surprise, to protect Tamsyn, to keep her secret. Because, clearly, Tamsyn was here incognito. There was no entourage, no sign of any companion. And for someone as famous as Tamsyn Harris to do that, there must be a significant reason behind it. As someone who was in Norfolk dealing with her own demons, Maggie could respect that, no matter how desperate she was to run after her and ask for her autograph. You have been listening to A.L. Brooks reading from Write Your Own Script.
You have been listening to Book Clips. Check out the show notes for the synopsis and buy links for this book. If you are interested in showcasing your novel, then check out the show notes for more information.